Welcome back to Performance Lab. Today I'm sitting down with my friend Nathan Shultz, a top-level coach and strategist who once led $500 million brands and now helps founders and executives step into purpose-driven growth. We go deep into what it really means to feel alive, why knowing what you don't want is just as important as knowing what you do, and how strategy, story, and state are the real levers for transformation. If you've ever felt stuck, unclear, or hungry for more meaning, this conversation is for you.
Nathan, welcome to the podcast. Hey, Michael, great to be here. I'm a executive coach and offer three main things: leadership work, relationship work, and career transition. And how did I get here? That's a longer answer, which I'll just kind of give the top line. Essentially, I just came to a place where I realized what my purpose is. And that's really just offering my gifts as the best that I can. And what I've recognized that to be is offering my life experience and everything that I've learned all the way. And essentially that breaks down to two chapters. One is 15 years of corporate and consulting and consumer products brand management, sort of like a business savvy leadership piece. And then really the last 10 years, which has been more around human transformation, wellness, spirituality, ecology, awareness, development, performance, all these great things that just that just even make me giggle as I just say them all out loud in one breath. It's like, whoa, yeah, I get to do that. And what got me from chapter 1 to chapter 2 was like the most beautiful rock bottom moment where there was kind of a segue.
One of the things that's common in the people who appear on this podcast is pivots. And one of the things I think a lot of pivots have in common is what you learn in the first direction and the first trajectory. You have no idea at the time how that's going to allow that pivot and inform that. And, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's skills, abilities, experience. Sometimes, as you said, it's that original trajectory that's actually, it's up for a while and then it leads to downward and you're like, wow, that was not the direction I want to go in. Let's recreate something. But it's always informed by that first piece, right? How does that resonate in your story?
It definitely resonates because after I had my rock bottom moment and I was sort of at this place of what do I do next? Right. I was in like the hole of the pivot, knowing that I had to pivot, but having no idea how to pivot. Really, the only thing I knew at the very beginning was that I couldn't go back. There was just so much realization on it's not me. It's not what I want in my life to be a corporate guy. So I think awareness, big thing in awareness generally is sometimes just knowing what you don't want. And before that moment, I thought that it was really the only possibility for me. So there was almost like a 180-degree shift of perspective and possibility and in the future of my life. Once I kind of did a lot of healing work and arrived on center and clarity, ready to kind of go out into the world with some of these new gifts that I had acquired in my journey, that last chapter came in. So like I combined, I love this transformation piece. I'm going to apply it to what I used to do in the past. So it was like, how do I make business be a force for good? How do I work with leaders to be their best selves?
And now you help executives go through a similar transition like you did. One of my favorite coaches that I've been working with for some time talked about authenticity, and someone else or termed it more alignment. But a lot of times we think about authenticity as being true to our current self or even our past self, right? Because that's what we know, that's our identity. And in order to make a shift or make a transition and a change, you need to reorient your authenticity to that future self that you want, not your past identity. Do you address this with the people you work with?
Not per se by naming it in the way that you did. And I love the way that you just put a frame around all that, because it does speak to the process. In the way that I work to it is having a very beginning purpose discovery session to get people into an altered state. And in that, to arrive at what is their purpose, mission, and legacy, and what is their 5-year plan. So it's like all the blinders are off, all the guardrails are off. They don't have the chatterbox mind. It's like, boom, we go straight to what's popping. And then after that, after the dust settles, we just arrive at sort of like what's in the way of that. And oftentimes there are habits in the way, there are lack of resources, there are skill gaps, mindset, whatever it is. We just identify the gaps and we just work the plan. It's not um it's very organized in a certain way. It's like we're just gonna go off and close some gaps and get you to the promised land.
What's the most common misconception that high achieving professionals have in finding that purpose, finding what, as you started off, what feels alive?
The misconception in feeling alive, I think that they think that they already know what it is when they've never actually felt it. So often it's more they're operating from a mind state where they think they want this and they've never actually had a felt experience of pure centeredness and clarity. If you're like imagining yourself at the top of a mountaintop, just sort of like sitting and it's like, okay, you see everything. Like they not actually had that moment yet. So they have some vision that may not actually be what's true for them. And it's either driven by maybe past conditioning or societal conditioning or maybe something else.
I know you led a men's group in New York, and it was featured in some high profile publications and articles.
Yeah.
How does that work with the men's group intersect with the coaching that you do?
Great question. Well, I mean, in a certain way, it prepared me over the course of a couple years holding space and working with a couple handful of men for 3 hours every Monday. There was so much experience on helping people transform and change their life. So I just built some serious muscle in that process. And I also just acquired a lot of skills which don't necessarily lend themselves to just men work. They lend themselves to transformation in general. And so they just sort of like immediately clicked and dragged over to the executive leadership work or the transition work. For instance, one really solid skill that we developed in the men's work was pulled from somatic experiencing, which Peter Levine is sort of the grandfather of. And I don't know exactly what to call it, but it's more about like embodied processing, where we find somebody has an issue or a feeling they can't get past, and we guide them into where that lives in their body, and then are able to sort of process it in a somatic way to release, to then get into what do they want in their life. And we went through this very simple process hundreds of times. So that's just one quick example.
I want to talk a little bit about masculinity and the masculine and the feminine and flowing between. And for people who have not experienced the power of a men's group, maybe that's a great place to start. I haven't found one where I am now and would love to find one or start one. So there's a lot around that I'd like to dive into.
Love it. Yeah, it gives me, so I'm feeling the energy that I asked for right now. It's like I got some little goosebumps going there. So well, the immediate thing that strikes me as you're talking about that is if one's looking for masculinity and they're looking for a group to have that, and if men's circle might be the way, and it's like you haven't found it yet, there's a lot of different men's circles out there. And the sauce that we created in ours, I believe, was the safety. And I think in most, if you really want to go super deep, you have to have safety. And what are one of the things that create that safety? Like on the feminine side, it would be somebody going deep. And then the adage is like the deeper that one person goes, others can follow. And then somebody else goes deeper, and then somebody else feels safe to go deeper. So there's a feminine construct that I believe creates safety. And then there's a masculine construct that at least we found created safety. And I would say it's more of this working with the attributes of the masculine that are time and space, commitment to that. So it's just like every Monday, 7 to 10, if you're in the city, you better fucking show up. And if you don't, we're going to talk about it. And it was held in my apartment, and in that space, I held it as a sacred container for transformation. The amount of intention that I seeped into my space to be like, we are going to create magic here. We're going to help people heal. We're going to help people get their dreams. It came from an extremely deep part of me that came from me having the same experience at my yoga teacher's house, doing certain studies. And so I brought that in. There's another attribute of the masculine, which I think is like meticulousness and awareness. So I had the place clean. I had the circle, like we were fucking need in need. There was no gap. There was no open chair. There was no dude on the floor laying down. And people were attentive, aware, and upright. So there was a cultivation, aliveness, focus, commitment, and safety. And that was juicy, where it's like, okay, that's a container I can rest in, let go. And when somebody says me, go into your body and release that knot of some hairy shit that happened a long time ago, I can then do that. And
I can tell how powerful it was, the magic you created. One of the things I want to highlight from what you said is that commitment. And I was just talking earlier about meditation. And if you just set aside the time and you sit, because that's what we talk about in the yoga and mindfulness circles, is we call it sitting. And it doesn't really matter what happens. If you do it every day for 30 to 60 minutes, magic is going to happen. Take the pressure off, right? And just put your phone away, maybe set a timer, and then just unplug and do it every day, and magic is going to happen. Maybe it's incremental or maybe it's exponential. It happens, all of a sudden, but just having that and that commitment, as you said, to that, and then the environment, right? You set up an environment that cultivated this. And I think those are two important points when you're trying to create a habit, especially around something like purpose and changing your mind or your body, right? Or your life. Those two are really,
you nailed it. I mean, that sings the song right there.
And then the other piece you didn't necessarily say is that community, right? It is also really important. And who you're spending your time consistently with. It's part of the environment, but there's another piece to that as well.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. I love the adage that you are, the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with.
Absolutely.
So it's absolutely. Especially when you sit in a circle, or if you sit with anybody, but when you sit, and just like we are right now, when you sit in a circle, it's all those bodies harmonizing, attuning. Like we're all tuning forks to each other, and it's like whatever we're putting out, giving off, exuding, being, it's like we're all taking some of that in, absorbing that nourishment of what other people have to offer.
Absolutely. Yeah, I looked around a few years ago and said, I'm not proud of the 5 people that I'm spending most of my time with, and I need to upgrade my friends. And I recently wrote down my 5, and I was like, fuck yeah, man. I've upgraded, I've leveled up, and I'm really, really happy about that.
Yes.
You have a variety of diverse practices that you've been certified in, from coactive coaching, yoga, qigong. Maybe there's even more to add to that list, but it's a blend of East and West, and feels to me like the yin and yang and that balance, right? You bring a very balanced, diverse approach to things. Tell me about that and how that presents, how that manifests in your coaching.
So I really hold on to what you just said there with that balance. And I try to balance everything that I offer and do it without attachment or trying to be like, I know what you need and you need this influence in your life. I generally try to meet people where they are and where I feel there are openings where they could benefit from and they feel open and receptive to some sort of Eastern concept. I present it. I started yoga 20 years ago, have done a couple certifications, have taught classes, and started Qigong about 10 years ago, and also offer that in my work. And there's so many different esoteric ways it can show up in micro situations, but I'd say from a blanket approach, a way that I just sort of present it in a way that's very practical. And so one of the coaching frameworks I work with is working with 3 levers to create transformation. And that's strategy, story, and state. Strategy is like, what's the plan? What are we going to do? But the thing is, often we know what to do, but we can't do it because our story and the state stand in the way, or the story being the mindset, the story that we tell ourselves, or the state of energy can't allow us to execute the strategy. And that's a very easy framework for somebody who wants something without any of that cultural or religious or spiritual or energetic overtones to, is just like, okay, like, here's what you want. Like, how do we change your mindset and your energy? It's like, well, I have some breathwork practices and I have some Qigong practices where it's like, if you're open to it, we can create some change extremely quickly. And I've dialed it into, like, if you go to my website, have the pop-up window for like the free offer is a 35-minute practice of my greatest hits, where we do some Qigong, we do some breath work, and it's just a potent combo. And so I'll bring that combo into anywhere, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's a workshop, whether it's a retreat. And it's very just simple and clean. It's just like you go from A to B, and then people decide they see benefits, and usually they want more. They're more curious, and then it just opens up more doors.
I've heard of this, the 3 S's. At some point, it was popularized by Tony Robbins.
Yeah.
And
Tony's one of my heroes.
Yeah. And it starts with state, right? You kind of get in the state and then assess the story and then a strategy.
The way I learned it from Tony was that there wasn't necessarily a particular linear order to it. It's just a framework and 3 levers that you can work with it. So, everybody gets something from somewhere. So that may be a playbook from, a couple of influences behind him. But I, as it presents itself, I mean, my natural cadence typically working with clients is like, what is our strategy? And then we figure out what are the gaps. And oftentimes it's mindset and energy. And then these practices become a very practical, valuable thing to try out in order to then go accomplish the strategy. But, as you say that, like, do you start with state first? In a certain way, I also do that, right? Because the first thing I said was like, I get people into an altered state, and then I get them to tell me where do they want to be in 5 years and ask these sort of elusive questions around purpose, mission, and legacy. And then I'm like, hey, here's what you just told me. So I also work with state first. So I appreciate that aha right there.
That's what I'm here for, Nathan. Oftentimes we use in coaching that present tense in the future, right? Something that you're not right now, but instead of saying I will be, you're like, I am, a multimillionaire, right?
Yeah.
And when you're not, and you're saying I am, that's the story you want to tell yourself. But sometimes it's hard to put yourself in that state or tell yourself that story, even begin to create a strategy.
Well, there's a couple of things that come to mind, and one is what one of my yoga teachers said is fake it till you make it. I think there's really power in that. Is sometimes you're just down in the dumps and you need to just put on the hat. I'm fucking happy. I love life. And I don't care how you do it, just start walking that way. And just as we said, as you continue to practice something, put in the hours, the repetition, and you walk around, I'm happy, I love my life, you start to just embody it, right? And then there's this whole thing of like, as within, so without, like whatever it is that you're holding on the inside starts to reflect itself on the outside. So you just manifest this reality that you're happy, and like happy stuff shows up for you. And that's a potentially woo-woo way to answer that question. And I recognize that. And there's something to that. Another thing that pops up, like pulling from the men's work world, I've trained with David Data, who's considered to be one of the top in the world in sort of spiritual men's work, spiritual intimacy, and also John Wineland, his sort of like most famous pupil who's out there. And I've done a lot of embodiment around the masculinity that I want to cultivate and bring into my life and my relationships. And so we worked with the 4 classic archetypes of masculinity. There's a famous book, I'll get the words wrong, but it's some order: warrior, king, magician, lover. And we worked through embodied exercises of being, embodying the king, the regal, the sort of sovereignty, the peace. And like, I can just feel it light up my body in this moment. And I can be more kingly in a moment if I choose to. If I need to if I'm walking on the street and I feel like I want to be more badass, I will call in my warrior. And just my whole thing will change where I walk down the street as a warrior. So I think that embodiment can change your reality very quickly. I don't know if I answered that the right way, but that's what came through for me when you asked.
There's so many things I want to dive into. One of the things that I've been working on is just taking action. I've done the work. I'm strategic, right? I don't need more strategy. I just need to take action. And you don't need to figure out steps A through Z. You just need to figure out the first step. And then you get there, you arrive, and you say, is this where I want to be? Does it seem like the right trajectory? And if not, then you change, right?
Yeah.
But I think we as high achievers and intelligent people often want everything figured out before we want to know, right? We want to know. And what that brings to mind when you're talking is also trusting your intuition, trusting your strategy, right? And not always needing second opinion. And most of the time I don't need a second opinion because my brain told me and then my gut told me that was a second opinion. I didn't need any external second opinion.
Oh man, I totally relate to that. Yeah, I live in that world right now.
You always regret the things you didn't do. How often do you look back and regret the things that you did? Many, many times fewer. And so, it's a challenge for me, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that of just taking action. I've something on my wall right here that just says, take action.
I appreciate this concept in so many ways. The way I recognize it right now, and I think I kind of see it in you as well, is like I've done so much work around what is my purpose, what is my plan, right? What direction that I'm going in. I've gotten the gremlins out of the way. I've like tuned my body up, right? And so it's like I'm this workhorse now. And there's a part of me that still wants to go into this past self where it's like, you know what? I want to like sit with a coach or a BFF or a guy from my circle and like, let's hash this over, or I want to hear it from you. And so I see it as like part of that, like more student part of me maybe has some remnants. I see it as, this actually feels deeper for me right now, is that I've owned that I am a relational being. And it took me a while to figure that out when I was just like, why do I have to keep talking to people when I know exactly it's because I'm a relational being. I'm not a person who just sits on a cushion and sits in a corner and does the work. I am, to the thing we talked about in the beginning, is I am extroverted in a certain point where I just love being in relationship with other beings. It makes my life alive and juicy. And I want that juice for me to then go off and create 3 hours of content, 3 hours of powerful client sessions. And so now I'm just like, okay, I do know everything and I trust myself, and I'm just going to make sure that I have that juice in my life. And so I make sure I have a healthy dose of, like, a lot of times just calling guys from my men's circle that was 3 years ago, right? We're still on each other's speed dial. But if I'm just like, hey, what's shaking and baking, and like, let's just like jam out for a second. I want a soundboard. And it just creates that aliveness for me. And then I'm able to be like, okay, I'm going to go back out and go do the thing. And then the last thing that comes up for me is this concept of emergence. Like, sort of like the strategy for execution is like, have a direction and just know what is the next step. It's not about what is A to Z or steps 1 through 10, because if you believe in emergence, after you take that next step, number 2 will reveal itself in order to get to here. So it's just like, trust in what is emergent. Like, what does your instinct and intuition tell you to do after you just created?
I love that. It brings to mind for me a practice of identifying the what and not worrying about the how, and just being super clear on the what, because the how is so limiting, because the what can come from the heart, but the how comes from the head. And sometimes the head gets in the way of that. And you don't dream big enough, right? You're limiting because you're like, but I don't know all the steps of the how, so I'm not going to lean into that that what as much. Two questions I'm going to implement in taking action or not taking action, asking what is the consequence of not taking action? And then what is the worst case scenario if I'm wrong and I do take action? And that really brings clarity. And oftentimes the worst case scenario is not nearly as bad when we really face it. It's not nearly as bad as we think it's going to be. And the consequence of not taking action would be really severe, or limiting or
Sure.
detrimental.
Absolutely. I like those two questions. And in my experience, when I don't do anything and I'm static, for me, it creates inertia and stuckness. I get more in my mind and it becomes a doom loop that just like goes nowhere super quick. And, when I do take action and it works, okay, that's great. There's also a lot of moments where I take action and I fail, but then that reveals what's next. So it's like the classic model of you're either growing or you're winning. So failure is strategy for success. So it's like, go take action, fail, and then you'll figure out what to do next. And you keep doing that until you get the magic formula. But if you don't do anything, then nothing may happen. And it's a very parallel strategy to the lean startup strategy from the book Lean Startup. In the startup world, I mean, that's what startups basically do is they create an MVP, a minimum viable product, and then they go put that thing out in the marketplace, and fail as quick as they can, get a ton of learnings, respawn, and then they keep going through that model until they win. So
Yeah.
I found that frame resonates a lot. Was just use the lean startup method for taking action in your life. They're like, oh, okay.
I was told recently to replace strategize and optimize in my lexicon with like a pilot, right? You're just a pilot study, right? You're just testing, right?
Yeah.
You're not, and then that failure, right? Because that's a loaded word,
Oh yeah.
we throw that around and like, oh, you just fail and then you learn from it. Like, okay, like how often is a failure that light that you're just like, oh, fuck it, I failed but I learned a lot from it. Like that's not the frame of reference that most people have with failure. There's a lot deeper to that. But I think we maybe overlook or just jump over failures, especially as high performers and the people that you work with. But they're not batting 1,000, right? There were a lot of failures along the way that made them who they are and gave them the strength. And I don't think you can't be the greatest version of yourself without failing. You're limiting what you're doing if you're only batting for successes.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Totally agree.
So one of the things you talked about with the people you work with is aligning to their purpose and what else?
Purpose, mission, legacy. And within that, there's some kind of micro spaces that are more tangible and day to day, which are like, what do you look like when you're at your best? Like, what's that mode? And then what is your genius zone? What is the thing that you do better than anything else that gets you into flow state that you can do for hours, time stops, like, the magic maker for you. So I kind of have these more lofty things and then some more tangible, practical home bases that we work with to line up to.
One of the things I've been thinking about recently as I figure out what this podcast is going to look like, what I'm going to call it, because we're early stages, and I just launched this about a month ago, and I'm about 20 episodes in, and I have about another 10 to 15 lined up. After the right now it's the Michael Donovan podcast, and it might be what it is. And I was thinking all the way back to my childhood, what lit me up back then. I was just at a venue that had a little magic show, and I was like, I used to be really into magic. I should find some magicians to interview. Like, I remember the first time when I was probably like 10 or 11 years old, my dad took me to see David Copperfield back in the day. And I remember the first time I walked into a Major League Soccer stadium in DC and saw DC United playing, and like, I should interview a soccer player who was an idol back then. Like, I don't know if they'd say yes, but like, who I am. And I think this was all sparked by your mention of legacy, because I think what we can become really framed by who we are, which is these early, the foundation is set in the first, 10 to 15 years of our life, and then we build on that foundation. But our relationship with our parents, our relationship with our peers, what we were interested and passionate about. We weren't worried about making money, right? We weren't worried about, it was just, it was student loans. I'm thinking of that song that says, I forget the lyric, but we just what was in us, and that's still in us, but sometimes we tamp it down and we don't want to lean into it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that you say this, because that's one of the 18 questions that I ask in the purpose discovery session, to sort of get into the ballpark of who is somebody at their core, like what are they here to do, like what is their purpose. I pulled this from a practitioner named Nick Craig, who wrote a book, and I was at his workshop. I think it's like Leading with Purpose. People reveal this time over time, like who they were as a kid, and I'm able to tie that into what they're doing now. It's just like, it's you with the Legos, dude. You love to tinker. You're still a tinkerer as like a CTO. And it's like, you love to tinker and build worlds. And then they feel it from this larger frame of who they are at the core. There's a saying from one of the spiritual teachers that I follow, Matt Kahn. I think it was Lee Harris. And he talks about that same moment to discover your purpose. And then once you figure out what you were doing as a kid, as an adult, to continue to water those seeds as soul seeds. And the more that you water those seeds, the more that your soul and soul purpose blooms. And so I was recently working with a client who, like, we got into that space, and for him it was drawing, and he hadn't drawn in a while, and he had some of these breakthrough moments. There was like, the practice was go back to drawing, like sketching, like I don't care what it is. It was the same. That was the practice. Water those soul seeds and like let yourself bloom, because he was in a moment of like, okay, just sold my company. What do I do next? Right? I have everything. And so we're not saying that like he's off to go become an artist, but if he is that artist who's a part of the deepest part of him, epiphanies can bloom from that, whether it's like whatever is that next thing. And he probably might find how the artist shows up for him in that leadership role.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast recently where they were talking about doing things that are like 15 degrees away from what you really want to do, doing creative things, whether or not you're like a great artist, but like doing some sketching and things like that. And it just lights up the brain in a way.
Yeah.
Brings life into, and then brings energy in, and then you can direct it in a different way. But it brings in that the energy and I love that the soul leads. Someone who came to mind, I just came across about a month ago, is a gentleman named Peter Crone, who is kind of a thought leader in.
Was he the mentor?
Calls himself
Tony Robbins. Is that the guy who was like one of the original, or is he somebody different? Oh no, he's more of a financial.
No, he calls himself the mind architect, and he's British, and I witnessed him at a conference, and he dove deep with someone who was willing to be vulnerable in front of a group of strangers, and did like what I would consider like years of therapy in 20 minutes.
Nice.
And just asked those questions that you're talking about. Was there a time in your childhood that, informed this? And I mean, that's what so much of therapy is, coaching is about. It all goes back to that. And I wonder if you would indulge me. I don't know anything about your childhood or your family, but I wondered if you could share about your childhood or your parents, because they've made a wonderful man, and I'd love to hear about them if you'd be willing to share.
Oh my God. Yeah. It just warms it just really opened my heart, just saying that. And so the first thing that comes to mind is that my dad was a CEO and my mom was a nurse. And so here I am in the way that I hold leaders that I work with as sort of, I hold them in a sacred, caring, loving way, right? So it's almost like I'm a nurse for CEOs right now. Or like literally I'm half my mom and my dad at a just very like raw, rough level. Yeah, there's so much in my childhood, like, and I think I'll just do my best taking like a top line. My father was an alcoholic and my mother was incredibly anxious and I was an empathic sponge. And so what happened was I gained a ton of gifts from that experience. And so I love both of my parents deeply. I believe that I chose my parents before I came into this life to learn these lessons, get these gifts, and go help people with them. And I learned a gift of, or a superpower of hypervigilance, like, because I was always scanning for safety in the household. So it's honed tuned my intuition like a knife, like I have a superpower of seeing and feeling and sensing. And because I energetically and emotionally and sort of held space for the safety of my mother, I developed incredible empathy skills, the ability to help other people, to help them in the same way that I built that muscle when I was a little kid. And after, I would say, my rock bottom moment when everything exploded, I came to learn those gifts that I learned in that, and then also sort of gained recognition of unhealthy patterns that I had downloaded, absorbed, modeled from my father in that relationship. And it began my journey of into healthy masculinity, and was just a really powerful frame for like who I don't want to be as a man and who do I want to be as a man. The ability now to lead in men's circles or just even just speak as a man to other men, I have an experience and a history and a change in my life where I've embodied toxic masculinity into healthy masculinity, from being a pleaser, overgiver, victim, empath, just taking on healthy boundaries, powerful intuition, incredible empathy skills. So, in a way, it's like my childhood was the cauldron of my hero's journey. It's like one of the caves that I went into to go get these experiences and build skills. So this could go a million different ways at this point. So I'll just pause right.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Is there any more you want to talk about the rock bottom moment? I didn't ask anything about that, but I wonder if there's anything more you want to share.
Well, I'd say it was probably my second and like last cauldron, probably a cauldron since then, but that's like little, maybe for a different podcast, that really made me who I am now. And so that rock bottom moment was after that 15 years of corporate, I got to a level of being sort of depressed, down and out, drinking on alcoholic levels. And so there was a sudden divorce. My father suddenly passed away, and I was fired from my job. And that was what created my spiritual awakening. Like my ego was shattered so much that the strong mind that I had, where it's just like, this is who I am, and I'm going to keep doing this thing and have these behaviors and habits, it just woke me up to two other possibilities and a deeper sort of like soul within me and sort of spiritual reality that led me into all the, the dance, the qigong, the yoga, all these healing practices and modalities, and on my self journey of what is my purpose. And that's what caused me to go figure out what those 18 questions are. As an A-type at the time, I scoured the marketplace for, it was like, okay, like how does one find what their purpose is? Like I literally, that's how I ended up at the workshop with Nick Craig. That's how, I went to all these different sources and read these obscure books. So it's that rock bottom was one of my greatest gifts that sort of offered me like how I'm able to be of service now. And that's what's important about that for me.
Thank you. We've talked about intuition and empathy. Some of the other guests I have on this talk a lot about the data side and the metric side and what do we measure. Wonder if there's anything that is more quantitative, because I feel that yin side so much, right? And it, you just described going more from the very strong yang of the corporate world, really leaning into the yin, but it was informed by process and structure and these kinds of things. How does that manifest now in what you're doing, like data and measurement?
Data and measurement. I would say in my own life, that aspect of yang hasn't been existent for me. There's no numbers that I've been tracking in any of my transformation except for my yearly revenue, right? That's a real metric. And it's not, the number is not neither good nor bad, but it's just a data indicator of like, what's going on here? I'm making a ton of money. Like, okay, what's that saying about who I am right now, how I'm putting myself out there? What are the marketing practices that I'm doing? Or what's the internal energy and frequency that I'm putting out there? That's one quantitative metric that I use. For clients, I don't hold any data things that are important to me. I just figure out what are the data metrics for them that are important. We'll track their company KPIs. From a personal level, sometimes I get into micro trackers with transformation around, a very simple one is just like, hey, how are you feeling? Scale of 0 to 10, your practice is to record that number 3 times a day. And then, I've had somebody look at that over the course of weeks and months. And there are things for them, insights for them to glean is like, oh, what was happening when I was super happy? What was happening when I wasn't? And then there's a very easy way for data to reveal what's going on. The yang that I've rested more with is around the container that I offer, container and structure that I offer. So container along the lines of like the men's circle container, like I bring that whole ethos to a client relationship that happens over Zoom. And then structure wise, it's that first month of structure that we create the project, like where it's like 4 signature sessions. First one is purpose. Second one is the plan with like the 5-year, 3-year, 1-year, 6-month, 90-day, 30-day goals. The next one is the genius zone. And then the fourth one is always a grab bag. But there's a very clear structure with a tight container that for me is the yang that I bring in, and whatever numbers are important for them, we can kind of work with them that way.
Got it. Thinking back to a younger version of Nathan, what advice would you give to 20-year-old Nathan?
Wow, my immediate thing is part of my childhood magic was just my play and joy and laughter. In my 20s, I was really unhinged. I was very unfiltered. Like I really gave 0 fucks. Like even though I was in this like, one of the, at the time in the dot-com boom of 2000, like considered one of the top digital strategy boutique houses in the world, Diamond Technology Partners, then Diamond Cluster, and now acquired by PwC. I was hell on wheels. Like people still tell stories about how I showed up to this insurance client in Erie, Pennsylvania with a faux fur A-line women's fur coat with like glitter still on my neck that I couldn't wash off from like clubbing, the 2 nights before, rolling in Monday morning. So from that thing, I was a kid at heart, and I don't know that little Nathan would have told him to do it any different way. What I hadn't even bridged on at that moment was doing any type of inner child work. Right. I didn't even know what an inner child was. So little Nathan would have said, like, dude, like, can you recognize I'm here? I'm in your belly, man. Like the reason why you're over drinking and womanizing and staying out until 4 a.m. and like you can't get enough is because I'm fucking screaming and crying at you inside and you have no idea that I'm here. I wasn't taken care of as a child. And I'm asking you to do that and you cannot even hear me right now. That's
Well, I think we should wrap up for today. We could go on and on and on. Maybe a part 2 is in the future. With all the amazing experiences you've had along your journey so far, I always like to ask, what's next?
I want to go train as a salsa dancer for a couple of weeks in Colombia. I'm entering certification as a 5 rhythms dance instructor next year. I'm blossoming out of the closet as intimacy and relationship coach in the marketplace. That's a part of my destiny. And at some point, a life partner is what's next for me, with no particular timeline.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Nathan.
Yeah, you're really welcome. I've loved this.
Where can people find you?
.com. Yeah, reach out. I do 1 hour complimentary consultations and sample sessions. So like super low risk. There's a bunch of programs on the website. You can get that free download. The 35-minute practice, there's offers there to change your career. I've got a program out now for intimacy relationship 2-on-1 coach or 1-on-2 coaching, and then business relationship coaching 1-on-2, for like CEOs and COOs or, founders, what have you. There's lots of good stuff. So many directions we can go.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Any parting words, closing thoughts?
Just that I'm really grateful for this. This was really nourishing for me, and it offered me some of that juice right from the men's circle, like depth, container, intimacy, shit that really matters. So it just filled me up. So yeah, just that. Thank you.
Awesome. You feeling alive? We're successful.
Yeah, alive, baby.
Awesome.
10. I'm gonna do the quant. I'm a 10 right now.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much, Nathan.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.
You too.
You've been listening to Performance Lab. I'm Dr. Michael Donovan, reminding you that peak performance is a journey, not a destination. For more cutting-edge insights and actionable tips, subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media. Until next time, keep pushing your limits and stay tuned to the Performance Lab.